Hey everybody, welcome back to Stonks on Rails. We're picking up where we left off in the previous episode, where we were replacing AJAX calls in the legacy application with the new turbo way of doing things. One of the things that I'm starting to figure out here is that because of turbo streams, you may not need AJAX most of the time. In most cases, you can use turbo frames to send instructions to the backend that will manipulate the HTML page and avoid all of the JavaScript jQuery and AJAX request. And this seems to be the whole concept of what they mean by HTML over the wire. You have your front end make a request through Turbo, and your back end will send back some type of a Turbo stream that's going to be directly inserted into the DOM on the front end, thereby manipulating the page. So when we finished the last video, we created a form for adding a new stonk note that we now want to turn into a modal form. Right now it's on the main part of the page, but it's hidden because of the Twitter Bootstrap Modal CSS class. If we remove that, we should be able to see the form. We can currently use this form to send dummy requests to the backend that will get reflected back onto the page. No validation is currently in place on the back end. So the first thing I'm going to do here is modify that new stonk note form so that it displays as a modal dialog box when you click the new note button. And I'm going to do that using the Twitter Bootstrap, CSS classes, and JavaScript. This step of building out all the forms in the HTML or Slim template engine takes a lot of long, boring writing code, and I think your time is best spent looking this over in the GitHub repository. So check out the link that I have down in the video description. And while you're at it, don't forget to hit the like button on this video and subscribe to my channel. The more subscribers I get, the more encouraged I am to continue making this type of content. So your feedback is very valuable for me. Don't forget to leave some comments and let me know what you like and how I can make these videos better. So let's take a quick peek at how I'm going to structure this form now as a modal dialog. In Twitter Bootstrap, there's several layers of the modal content. So you have the top level modal, which I think is what hides the box. And then you have modal dialog. I'm not exactly sure what that does. And then we have modal content. And then we have the three sections of modal content inside of it. So there's three levels. I don't know why they have the redundancy of dialog and content, but I'm going to go ahead and build out the structure in my Slim template. So now I've got the skeleton of the form written out, but I have a small problem here. When you click on the Create button, it'll return the newly created stonk note as you see popping up in the background, but ideally we'd also want the form, the modal form, to close when the stonk note is created. So how do I trigger that to happen for it to automatically close the form? My initial inclination was to try programmatically doing it using a stimulus controller. So I wrote some code as a stimulus data action handler that runs some code to close the modal. This piece of code is based on a section of the Twitter Bootstrap documentation that demonstrates how to dynamically create a modal form and toggle it open and close. But this approach didn't work out really well. And I think what was going on here was that the code it was running was creating a new modal object. So effectively, it was doing something like toggling a modal on top of a modal. It was like a separate object it was accessing and not the one that we were actually looking at. I needed to find the existing open modal box on the page and was having some trouble getting the JavaScript to be able to find that and adjust the state accordingly. You also just can't hide the modal form because it's not just the box that's appearing, but the background on the page is dimmed out as well. So it's necessary to unwind the entire state that Bootstrap initiated when the modal was opened. The solution I found that does work for this situation is to think from the perspective, how would the user close this form if Stimulus.js was broken? They would click the X button to close it, which works by triggering the already in-memory Twitter Bootstrap event handler. So why not just have Stimulus.js simulate a click of that button when you want the form to close? And that's exactly what I did to solve this. I had Stimulus initiate the click event on that DOM element. Now you'll probably notice that at this point I'm making use of the turbo submit end event to determine when the stonk note creation and associated web request to the backend is complete and the form can be closed. This works fine if you want the form to close regardless of status, but what if an error occurs? What if there's a condition where you want the modal form to remain open, such as to display a validation error message? Initially, I thought you can just check the response code on the HTTP request, but a response with a Rails validation error will still return a status of 200. You need to check the actual response data to determine whether validation errors are included in the response. So, how can we do that? This is a problem that had me stumped for a few days actually. I played around with all the turbo events trying to find one that would let me see what data was in the HTML response. The problem with the submit end is that it fires before the new content gets rendered on the HTML page, so if I check for any changed attributes in the dialog box, they wouldn't be available yet. I tried looking at before render and before stream render, but ran into the same issues of timing. What I'm really looking for is an event that fires after both the web request is complete and the new content is rendered in HTML. So I then went digging on the Hotwire discussion board, where the creators of the project actively participate and interact with the community, and I found this post here suggesting that the connect lifecycle callback in stimulus can be used for this purpose of determining when an element is swapped out on the page. So what I found works for the desired behavior here is to place that connect method on the controller that I'm using exclusively on that modal dialog box. In my Turbo Rails template, I make sure to replace that whole dialog box in its entirety so that it gets fully re-rendered and the lifecycle callbacks get initiated. So here's a demonstration of the finished functionality of the front-end modal box. We're going to type in some text, create a stonk note, and the modal box disappears because it was successful. So what happened just there was that when we clicked the create button, it submitted the form, which was intercepted by Turbo. Turbo sent the form data as a JavaScript fetch request, basically an AJAX request, and the backend did the processing. What was returned is a Turbo stream with all of the necessary HTML to replace the contents of that dialog box. And once the dialog box contents were replaced, the stimulus controller got reinitialized, which triggered the connect lifecycle callback, as you can see in the log message I have down in the console. And then the stimulus code ran, and because there were no validation errors, it performed the click action on that close button, the X, which triggered the bootstrap event to close the box. So now let's take a look at what happens when there's a validation error. The same set of events occur, but this time the HTML code for the refreshed modal box contains a validation error message. When the stimulus controller connects this time, it's able to find the validation error message div and therefore doesn't close the form. So what are some key takeaways that we learned in this video? Well, first of all of your state in Turbo and Stimulus should be stored in the HTML page itself. There's no need for a state container like you have in Redux, and I think this will simplify your code tremendously versus if you use one of those popular large-scale JavaScript frameworks. I've worked with React before and even Vuex, and the thing I absolutely hate most about those frameworks is the amount of boilerplate that you need to manage the amount of data on the page, which may be a very small amount of data. There's sending around events and actions and dispatching whenever just the smallest thing on the page changes. Here, Turbo does a lot for you. It's very AJAX driven, but I think it gives you a much simpler structure to work around the AJAX. And Stimulus, the controllers do give you a nice way to consolidate your code. Second, I think this demonstrates that rather than making programmatic AJAX triggers yourself based on events like you did with older versions of Rails, now you can treat every action that queries the backend as a form. So you're essentially just setting up some form with hidden data or even user entered data. And when the user is done filling out that form, it gets submitted by like a submit button. And we even did this in the previous video where we had a load more button that was hidden on the bottom of the page. And when the user scrolled down, this form would automatically be triggered. There would be some variable set, and it would send a query for new information from the back end. But essentially, it was just a form, and the end user wouldn't know that it was a web form. It would seem automatic. Third, in this video, we had a problem figuring out how to make an event that occurred after a web request was made, but also after the rendering was complete. There were some events within Turbo that happen before a rendering occurs, but what happens when you need the updated information after the page and the new data was rendered? And the best way of handling that is to have a stimulus controller within that new rendered data, well, actually a stimulus controller link, and when it connects to the stimulus controller, it will trigger the connect method. And that's when you could execute any code that needs to be acted based on the new data on the page. And finally, as far as documentation goes, I found that a valuable resource here is the Turbo Stimulus Discussion Forum, which you could find on the hotwire.dev website. There's a lot of answers to common problems like this, where people have thought up the solutions and they've just kind of organized it there. You have to do a little bit of searching, but eventually you could probably find your way on how to crack a pretty tough problem using this forum. And I think when you read enough of the posts, it'll give you a sense of how Turbo was designed and the kind of mindset that you need to effectively use it. So this concludes this video. Be sure to hit the like button on it if you thought it was useful, subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you in the next video.